Hi, thank you for joining us for an advanced look at mobile testing on SOS by Jonathan Lips. My name is Rachel Lambert and I will be moderating. Jonathan Lips is the lead contributor to Appium and the senior backend developer here at SOS. For videos like this, check out our blog at sosio.com. Thanks again for joining us and happy testing. Take it away, Jonathan.
In case you're not familiar with Sauce Labs, we're a testing platform used by a lot of people to securely test their mobile and web apps. And today, obviously, the focus is on mobile apps. If you want to get all the details on how Sauce Labs provides this service in the cloud, feel free to go to the link below, saucelabs.com/mobile, which has a bunch of resources for getting started with using Appium to automate mobile applications on SOS. Appium itself is an open source tool. It's a cross-platform mobile automation solution, and it allows you to automate native and hybrid applications across multiple platforms, including iOS and Android. And Appium's webpage is appium.io, so feel free to navigate there if you want to learn more about the Appium open source tool or get involved in the Appium community. And this next slide is just a brief graphical depiction of what Appium aims to support. In other words, automation of simulators and emulators as well as real devices, native apps, hybrid apps, and mobile web apps across the two main platforms, iOS and Android, with more platforms coming in the future. And Sauce Labs supports most of these types of automation. The only thing we don't support yet is automating on real physical devices, and that's coming soon. And in case you weren't here last time, one of the most important things to know about Appium is that it has the same client-server architecture and the same protocol as Selenium WebDriver. So it essentially uses all the pre-existing infrastructure that's set up around WebDriver and allows you to use that to automate mobile applications. So if you're familiar with Selenium WebDriver, you can already write tests for your mobile apps using Appium. And if you're interested in why we made this decision, I'd like to refer you to a lot of the resources that are available online talking about Appium and its philosophy and why we chose Selenium WebDriver as the protocol of choice. So getting into new territory here, let's pick up from where we left off last time. Last time, we showed you how to automate a native iOS application on an iPhone using simple behaviors like finding elements, typing into text fields, clicking buttons, and using attributes of the elements available on the screen in order to make assertions about the state of your application. So Android support works exactly the same way, only you need to use a different set of desired capabilities in order to launch Appium to test your Android app. So this is a screenshot of a simple Android application that actually comes with the Android SDK. So if you're an Android developer, you're probably already familiar with this application. It's called API demos. And it's basically a collection of all the different kinds of APIs that the Android SDK offers. So it has a bunch of lists of different sort of guinea pig type pages where you can see different things that the Android SDK allows you to do, like draw graphics, for example. And this is a convenient test application to use to exercise different features of an Android application. So we can use Appium to automate this app. So here's a code snippet for you, which if you were here last time, you'll recognize as being very similar to the setup for an iOS test. So this example is in Python, but I want to stress that Python isn't necessary to use Appium or Appium on SOS. You can use any language you want that has a Selenium WebDriver client library. And Python has one, as well as Java and C# and JavaScript, PHP, and many other languages. So in this class, we have two functions, two methods, a setup method and a teardown method. And the setup method is responsible for creating the test session. The teardown method is responsible for ending the test session. So these methods are run before and after every test that will end up in this test case. So the interesting thing here is to look at the setup method. And again, it's exactly the same as what happened in the iOS test case that we looked at last time. We get our sauce username and access key from the environment, or you could just hard code them in as strings if you wanted. But for security, it's often a better idea to take it from an environment variable. And then we set the endpoint for the Appium server. And in this case, it's Sauce Labs' cloud address, ondemand.saucelabs.com. And we use HTTP authentication with our username and access key. And so here's where things get a little different. Our desired capabilities are a little more complex. So we set the device to be Android instead of iOS simulator, and the platform to be Linux instead of Mac. And now we have a couple other options. We actually have a choice of different versions for Android on Sauce. So this test is running against Android 4.2. Now, of course, we need a way to tell Sauce Labs what application we want to test against. And we can do this in two ways, which I'll explain in a moment. But the first way is simply to provide Sauce with a URL of the app APK. In this case, I've put one up on Amazon S3. So I'm sending it to Sauce as a URL. Now, for starting an Android app, we need a few other bits of information. We need the app's package identifier, which in this case is com.example.android.apis, but your application will have a different one based on the identifier that you've given to the app. So it would be com.yourcompany.appname or something like that. Android also has the concept of activities, and an app can have multiple activities, each of which could be switched back and forth between, or you could launch the app to a certain activity, and so forth. So we need to tell Appium which activity it is that we want to start the app with. In this case, it's the API demos activity. Now, in some cases, we might want to use one activity to start the app, but the app might transition itself into a different activity. And so we have another desired capability that we can use to let Appium know that we want to use one activity when launching the app, but we want to start automating when the app has already reached another activity on its own. So that's the app wait activity desired capability. But if the activity that you want to start your test at is the same as the one you use to launch your app, which is usually the case, then you don't need to include the app wait activity. So that's it. Basically, we just need to know all the things that you would need to know if you were to launch your application using ADB or something like that. So this is the setup and teardown function for a test class. Now let's look at an actual method. Oh, I forgot about this. I mentioned that there are two different ways to give Sauce your app for testing. One is to host the app on the web, which is what we're doing in this example. And the other is to use the Sauce Storage API. You can see documentation about how to use this API on our website. Basically, it allows you to post in some kind of file, in this case your APK file, to our servers where it will be stored. And you can access the file using a special identifier that you set and are able to put into your test code. It looks like sauce-storage, and then the name of your APK. That way, the Sauce virtual machines don't have to download your app from the web every time they want to run a test against it. And you don't have to host your app on the web somewhere that a random person might be able to retrieve it. Okay, so let's look at that test code. So one of the things that you can do in this API demos application is go to a page or a view that experiments with adding and removing tabs, like in a tabbed application. So in this little test, we're going to that view, we're adding a couple tabs, and then we're asserting that the second one that we added is actually present on the view. So it's a pretty simple test. First of all, we're going to find a couple list view items and click on them in order to navigate down through the hierarchy of views. So that's why we're clicking on the app list item and then the action bar list item, then the action bar tabs list item. Finally, we're clicking a button that puts us into tab mode. We are clicking a button that adds a new tab while we're in tab mode. And then we're clicking it again with the result that we've added 2 tabs to this view. And now we're getting the second tab that we added and making an assertion in regards to its text property. This is how we know that it actually showed up on the page. So when you run this test on Sauce, you get, as you'd be familiar with from last week, a nice summary of everything that happened. You get a list of commands, which WebDriver API calls were made in order to execute your automation behaviors, and a list of screenshots that correspond to those commands. So in the bit of the screenshot that we've captured here, you can see the second tab has been added, and that's how we knew that we had a successful run of this test. Of course, you can also share this test or make it public, and I've made this one public, so you could, for example, go to the link below if you wanted to watch the video of this test or look at the specific commands. So this is just one of the things that Sauce does beyond Appium itself that makes it a really nice experience for running your Android and iOS tests. So let's talk a little bit about the test code that we just saw. You might have noticed that we used a few different locator strategies. In other words, a few different ways of finding elements in the UI view in order to interact with them. So on Android, we have 4 main ways of finding elements in order to interact with them. The first is we can find an element by its UI type. This is kind of like finding an element by its tag name in regular WebDriver. So we could, for example, try to find all the elements that have a certain UI class, like android.widget.button, or we could even just say button for short. Likewise, we could try to find an element or elements by its content description value. This is the equivalent of the accessibility identifier for iOS. Android calls it content description. It's what's displayed to people who are using your app in accessibility mode. And so we use find element by name in order to get elements by their content description. And this is a great way to get a handle on a specific element without having to use some kind of hierarchical query. Of course, sometimes you do want a hierarchical query, and in that case, we can use an XPath syntax in order to find elements by their position relative to other elements on the screen. So we could, for example, find the first button underneath the first list, underneath the first relative view. And we could further constrain this search by saying that we want the button whose text is high. So this would enable us to find a specific button on the screen, even if there were multiple buttons with the same text, or even if there were multiple buttons underneath that list view that had different text. So XPath is a powerful yet often brittle way of finding elements. We can also find elements in API levels 18 and up by their resource ID. So you can just say find element by ID and then enter the Android ID that you're interested in finding. So now I want to make a note about Android versions. Because Appium relies on different strategies for automating Android applications based on the version of the device that they're running on. So if you're running a device with Android 4.2 or up, you can use Appium's native support, which uses Google's UI Automator under the hood. Unfortunately, UI Automator is not available on devices earlier than 4.2. So to automate those devices, for example 2.3, we use something called Cylindroid. And Cylindroid is a project that comes bundled with Appium that enables this older device automation. Cylindroid also has one other advantage, which is that it enables automation of Webviews, which are central to hybrid applications. Unfortunately, Google's newest technology doesn't enable us to automate Webviews inside of applications. So if you want either Webview support or to automate an Android application on an older device, you'll actually be getting Cylindroid under the hood. Now, this doesn't matter a whole lot, but you need to be aware that Cylindroid's API is slightly different from Appium's. So most of what I'm presenting in this talk is the API that Appium uses. And if you run into a problem with any of these commands while using Cylindroid, you'll just want to take a look at Cylindroid's webpage to check whether the command might actually have a slightly different invocation for Cylindroid. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about how to automate an Android app. Let's talk about how to automate Webviews on iOS and Android. First, let's take a look at iOS. There's a 5-step flow that you'll probably use whenever you want to automate a hybrid application. Now, you always start automating the app in native mode. In other words, when you perform some kind of find element command, you'll be getting the native elements in the application. Now, some applications have web views where the bulk of the application's behavior is located. In fact, an application might not have any native elements other than a web view. In this case, you don't really care much about automating the native layer of the application. Instead, you want to get into the web view and automate the web page just like you normally would with Selenium WebDriver. And so this is how you do it with Appium on iOS. First of all, you want to call driver.windowHandles. And of course, the particular form of this method call will look different based on your client library. But this is what it looks like in Python. So the result of this call is a list of IDs, and Appium will give you a list of all of the web views that are available to automate. Usually it's just one, but there might be more than one. So you want to pick the ID that corresponds to the web view that you want to automate, and you want to call the window method with that ID as a parameter. This tells Appium that we're going to switch the context to the web view. From then on, all of the commands that we send are interpreted as regular Selenium WebDriver commands in the context of that web view. So when we try to find elements, we'll be getting elements in the web page that is the visible page in the web view. We won't be getting any of the native elements. So of course, we might also want to go back out of the web view and automate the native layer again. And we need a way to tell Appium, hey, the commands I'm about to send need to be executed in the native layer, not the web layer anymore. And so to do that, we call execute script with a special command that isn't actually JavaScript, but it's a special command for Appium that says we want to leave the web view mode and go back to native mode. So these are the basic 5 steps that you need to use if you want to switch back and forth between native and hybrid automation on iOS. So here's an example in Python code. As in the previous slide, we're first calling driver.windowHandles in order to get a list of the available web views. Then we're switching context to the first available web view. Now we can use regular Selenium commands like driver.get. We can go to Google's website. We can find the input box and we can type in some keystrokes to that and we can perform a search using the regular WebDriver commands that we're all familiar with. And finally, we can call execute script, the mobile command to leave the web view, in order to get back out to our native layer and automate that again. All right, so now let's talk about automating web views on Android. Now, as I've already mentioned, WebView support is available only through the Selendroid automation backend. Now, you don't have to explicitly declare that you want Selendroid. Instead, you just add the WebView support desired capability to your set of desired capabilities, and Sauce Labs will automatically give you Selendroid because it knows that you want WebView support, and Selendroid is the only way to get that on Android. So if you add this to your desired capabilities, you'll be getting Selendroid. It's also true that if you add a version less than 4.2, you'll get Selendroid. So those are the two ways to let Sauce know that you'll be using Selendroid as the backend rather than Appium's native Android support. So after you begin your test with this desired capability, you also use the driver.window method, just like for iOS, but Selendroid has a hard-coded set of windows. So you just say that you want the web view, and that will switch the context to the currently active web view in the view. And then you'll be able to automate that web view using all the typical WebDriver commands. And if you want to switch back to the native layer, you just call driver.window with a string native. So here's an example of this. Let's say we have an application where you click a button in order to launch a web view. So we do that in the native layer, and then we tell Appium that we want to go into the web view itself. So we do that by using window with the string web view. And then we're able to find elements by CSS and other things like this that are only possible in the web. And finally, we can go back to the native layer at any time by posting to window again with the string native. So that's how you automate hybrid apps with Appium. Now let's move on to look at gestures. So in case you're not familiar with it, the WebDriver specification currently allows for a few different kinds of touch actions. And these work as you would expect in Appium. If you have a handle on an element, you can call element.tap or element.click. They do pretty much the same thing. You can also call element.longClick in order to perform a long tap on the element. The WebDriver specification currently also has a flick method, which takes two parameters, which is the speed in pixels per second that you want to go in the X and Y dimensions. So this command would say that I want to swipe or flick up, I believe, at a speed of 50 pixels per second. Of course, these few actions don't cover all the behaviors that we're familiar with in mobile app development. So we need a way to do that. So the way that Appium has come up with is to define a suite of special methods that are accessible via execute script. And these methods all start with mobile : and then the name of the method. So you can see here that Appium offers a number of gestures through this method. We can flick, swipe, drag, rotate, or shake. And each of these takes a set of parameters, using the same mechanism that execute script has always allowed for passing parameters to the script. Of course, we're not executing JavaScript with this command the way we would be in WebDriver. We're sending Appium a special signal that says, hey, I'm trying to access a method which isn't available in the normal protocol, and here's the name of that method: flick, swipe, drag, and so on. And then we pass the different parameters to these methods. So here's an example of the kinds of parameters that one of these methods might take. So let's say we have an application and we want to mimic a user putting their thumb in the middle of the screen and moving their thumb towards the upper edge of the screen with the effect that the application view will scroll down a bit. So we call execute script with the string mobile : swipe, and then we pass a set of parameters. And these are the parameters that mobile swipe takes: a start X and Y position, an end X and Y position, and a duration. In other words, how long the finger is on the screen. So in this example, we're starting right in the middle and we're moving a finger up to about 30% of the way down the screen. So it's a somewhat short swipe that takes a second. So I should say here that the way that you run execute script and the way that you pass parameters to these mobile methods differs from platform to platform, differs from client library to client library. So this is how it looks in Python, but in Java it looks different. And in JavaScript it looks different as well. So I recommend that you take a look at the gestures documentation for Appium and try and find examples for your language so you see the correct syntax for making use of these methods. And the link is on the bottom of this slide. So I should also say that some of the methods differ across platforms based on the underlying automation APIs. What I mean by that is iOS, for example, gives us a different set of available behaviors than Android in the underlying automation APIs. And so the way that we translate to each of them might differ in some small ways, but by and large, the mobile gestures work the same across both platforms. Some methods, like shake, only work on one platform or the other. So we can shake the device, or the simulator, I should say, on iOS, but not on Android. Something else that's really useful to know is that methods that deal with X and Y coordinates can take two different kinds of parameters. Your X and Y coordinates can be either relative, in other words, they can fall between 0 and 1, or absolute, meaning values of 1 or greater. So let's take a look at what this means. The example on the left is the same as what we just saw before, where we're using values like 0.5 and 0.3 and so on. So in this case, an X and Y value of 0.5 means 50% of the way across and 50% of the way down, or in the exact center of the screen. And a value like 0.3 means 30% of the way down or across the screen. This is a really useful way of making your tests work well on devices that have different screen sizes. Because when you're using relative values like this, the swipe will happen the same no matter whether you have a device that's 480 pixels tall or 800 pixels tall. Of course, sometimes we might want to use an absolute measurement. So we can just use values greater than 1, and Appium will interpret that as a pixel value. So things like 120 on the right side will mean 120 pixels from the left edge or from the top edge. And I apologize, the slide is incorrect here. It's not 120 pixels from the right. It should be 120 pixels to the right from the left edge of the screen. So the origin is the top left of the screen. Okay, so that's how you do gestures for both iOS and Appium. Now I wanted to tell you one more fun trick that you can use, particularly with iOS applications, where this is supported the best. But there are certain kinds of UI elements that allow you to set special types of values. For example, iOS has something called a picker wheel, which you can combine to let users choose between combinations of sets of predefined values. So for example, a date picker lets you choose October 12th, 1989, for example, by scrolling through different sets of wheels. So if we have an element in Appium that represents one of these wheels, we can use the send keys method with the string that we want the picker wheel to scroll to as the value, and that will make the picker wheel select that as its current value. Another type of UI element is a slider, something that lets users determine an amount, or I guess I should say a relative amount, by sliding a little tab left or right. If we have a handle on this, we can also use the send keys method with a string representing a value between 0 and 1 to move the slider different amounts. So sending 0.8 would move it most of the way to the right. Finally, iOS also has the concept of a page indicator, which lets you swipe left and right between different views. Maybe it's a set of pictures or something else. So if we have an element in Appium that represents one of these page indicators, we can use send keys with the index of the page that we want to move to, and the app will navigate to that page automatically. So these are really useful shortcuts for using in your tests so that you don't have to use gestures in order to swipe and scroll your way to the right value. All right, to close out this portion of the webinar, I'd like to talk a little bit about the future of Appium's API. So I want to begin by looking at a couple issues that exist with Appium's API that you probably noticed as we were going along. One has to do with this method of using execute script and passing a special string, which is prefixed with mobile colon. This is really a temporary solution that enables all the client libraries that currently exist to have access to these special mobile methods, which we've used to extend the WebDriver specification. Since all the client libraries from Java to Python to PHP have the execute script method, it was a great way to let all developers working with Appium immediately have access to these new methods without having to update the client libraries. Of course, it's not ideal because it doesn't provide native client access to these behaviors. It would be much nicer to just use driver.swipe instead of execute script mobile colon swipe, and then have to remember the particular set of parameters that you pass in. Another issue is the Selendroid integration that I mentioned earlier enables the use of Webviews in automation and enables automation of older Android devices. The fact that they have slightly different APIs makes it difficult to write cross-version tests or cross-platform hybrid tests. So if you have a test currently that works on Android 4.2, it's often not possible to take that exact same code and run it on an Android 2.3 device because of the slight differences that currently exist between Appium's API and Selendroid's API. So Appium is a great way to have access to Selendroid's functionality, but unfortunately, that functionality comes through a slightly different set of commands. So to help alleviate both of these pain points, Appium's developers have been working hand in hand with the WebDriver project to make, for example, the mobile gestures that are currently accessible by using execute script first-class citizens in the WebDriver clients themselves. In other words, we've defined an extension to the JSON wire protocol, which the WebDriver specification is based around, that will enable all of the different client libraries to implement these gestures as native methods. To address the second problem, we've also been working with other mobile automation frameworks like Selendroid to standardize all of our APIs so that they all work the same no matter what version or no matter what framework we happen to be using. So all of this is a work in progress, but I hope that you stay tuned because whenever we release these updates, I think it'll be a much better user experience for the developers who are writing Appium tests. Of course, it will also mean that the test code that you write today will eventually be deprecated in preference of these newer and better methods. So it's just important to have a little bit of awareness about what's coming in the future. Okay, thank you very much for paying attention to this webinar on what I consider to be advanced topics for Appium development and Appium testing. And I'd love to take some questions. So the first question is about whether mobile web automation will be available on real devices. And the answer is yes. You can already automate mobile web on Android quite easily and with a little bit more fuss on iOS. And so when the Sauce Labs cloud of real devices is released, we'll make every effort to make it as easy as possible to automate the mobile web on real devices. Someone asked if we have examples with Ruby. I would recommend going to Appium's codebase on GitHub, where there is a directory with lots and lots of examples. Lee asks whether the JSON wire protocol is supported, and indeed it is. So all of Appium's commands are based on the JSON wire protocol. So for the most part, you can just use the WebDriver commands that you're already familiar with in order to write and run Appium tests. Robbie asks whether there's any plans for Windows Phone 8. And I would love for somebody in the Appium community to do a little bit of research on the Windows Phone Automation API, because I would love to see it supported. But currently, no work has been done on that, so I don't have an ETA for when that will be supported. Somebody asks how secure the soft storage is for storing proprietary apps, and the answer is that it's very secure. There's no external access via the web or any other means to the place where these apps are kept. They're only accessible from our internal firewall cloud. If you have other questions about the security of this, I advise you to check out our documentation and email SOS support with additional questions that might come up in that process. Robbie also asked whether the page object pattern is encouraged with Appium. And the answer is absolutely. The page object pattern is just a good idea in general anytime you're doing UI functional automation. So the fact that we're talking about Appium as opposed to WebDriver is completely irrelevant. The page object pattern is just a way to keep your test logic and the specific ways of finding elements separate. And that's as good an idea with Appium as it is with WebDriver. Someone asked if we can find element by reference to a string. And if by that the asker is referring to the label or the text that element is displaying on the view, and the answer is yes. Using the XPath strategy, we can find elements that have certain properties, like their text, for example, might be hello world, or their label might be hello world. So there is indeed a way to do that. Obula asks whether we have access to Android custom views. And unfortunately, the answer is not really. Widgets or views which don't descend from regular Android views are not accessible using the UI Automator framework. And so there's no way for Appium to get a handle on those views. So if you have, I don't know, custom graphics views or things like that, you'll need to resort to using X and Y coordinates, for example, in order to click one of those views. Maybe some kind of screenshot verification if you want to verify that the view looks the way it's supposed to. Lee asks whether I have any recommendations on how to write a test fixture locally without uh, waiting for the latency of running on Sauce Labs. In other words, is there a way to speed up test development? First of all, I want to say that we at Sauce are aware that our Android emulators in particular have a certain degree of latency and take a little while to start up. And we're working on that to make them as fast as we can. But there is a way to speed up your test development, which is to get Appium running on your own computer. So visit the open source Appium page where there are instructions for installing and configuring Appium. And this will enable you to run your tests locally. You can then just have some kind of flag or switch when you want to run them in Sauce in parallel. Because running Appium locally, it's a little bit more difficult to run things in parallel. Cam asks what the timeline is for Sauce Labs and Appium to support iOS 7, and that's definitely a high priority, and I personally, along with others, are currently working on that, so the answer is as soon as possible. Obula asks whether it's possible to take screenshots on failures, and the answer is that it's possible to use Appium's own screenshot mechanism to get the base64 encoded PNG file to your local WebDriver client. Of course, this isn't super necessary because Sauce Labs keeps a series of screenshots during your test execution. So if you have a test that fails, you can simply log on to your account page, find that test, and then look at the screenshots all along the way to see what went wrong. Rudolph wants to know the difference between hybrid apps and mobile web. So hybrid apps are native applications which have some kind of web view inside of them where user functionality happens. So this could be a native app that uses a web view in order to show Google Maps, for example, or it could be something like a phone gap application where the native portion of the app is invisible because the entire screen is filled with a web view, and the user is really only interacting with a web application. It just happens to be on a device. So that's what a hybrid app is. By mobile web, we mean a web app that's being run in Safari, for example, or Chrome, Safari on iOS or Chrome on Android. So if you wanted to automate saucelabs.com, you would be doing that using mobile web automation. Now, if Sauce Labs decided to release a Sauce Labs mobile application by packaging up saucelabs.com inside of a web view in a native application, then that would be a hybrid application. Luis asks whether we can use Sauce Connect to run iOS and Android tests. And the answer is yes. The functionality of Sauce Connect works when using Appium on Sauce. So if your app talks to some kind of private backend that's not publicly accessible, if you're using Sauce Connect, those queries will go through. If you're using Sauce Connect, you can also host your application on a private URL, for example, in order to have Sauce Labs download it. Luis also asks if you get a playback or snapshot of errors if a test fails. And the answer is that you get a playback and a set of screenshots whether a test fails or not. So you always get the entire video of the test. And Arthi asks whether Appium can access inbuilt apps like contacts and so on. The answer is it depends. If you're running the simulator, you can access built-in apps. And if you're running Android, then you can access apps that are already installed on the device. Of course, if you're talking about automating them on the Sauce Labs cloud, you can automate the apps which are present there. But if your app is not already installed, then it won't do you very much good. So Lee asks, or mentions that the current gesture commands I said are temporary, and whether these are likely to enter the W3C standard, and what is the current status. I think I addressed this a little bit in my final slides, but we're in the process of coming up with a new shared standard that will be recommended to the W3C. Sujit asks whether it's possible to design a test for Android and run the same on sauce. And the answer is it depends. Depends whether your applications are designed similarly, and it depends on what kind of element locators you're using. If you're using, for example, the accessibility identifiers on iOS and the content description on Android, then the answer is yes. You'll be able to get the elements according to the accessibility identifier and content description the same across both platforms, and then you'll be able to do things like send keys and click and whatnot. So I have a long test available on YouTube that's available without too much Googling that shows you a very long test that's the exact same code run on both iOS and Android. Of course, you might have to do a little fiddling to find the elements on both sides, especially if you're using something like XPath. So you might have to keep some kind of dictionary or page object model with that encapsulates those differences. But in general, it's not that hard to write cross-platform tests using Appium. That's one of the points and why we designed Appium the way that we did. Elizabeth asks, choosing Appium does not equal choosing Sauce Labs for testing, is that correct? It's not a free community edition versus a higher premium edition. And that's absolutely right. Appium is an open source project. You can download it and run it on your own computer if you want. Appium is also available on Sauce, and it's exactly the same Appium that's available to everyone else. It's not a different kind of Appium. However, there are benefits to using Appium with Sauce. For example, all of the screenshots and videos that are stored for each test, the ability to run a limitless number of them in parallel, and so on. So developing tests locally makes sense with the open source version of Appium. But if you want to run a lot of tests in parallel, or to have it automatically scale as your build grows and as your suite of tests grow, then it's nice to just use Sauce. And with that, we've come to the end of the questions. If anybody has another question or two, I'll wait around for another minute, and then if nothing else pops up, I'll go ahead and end. So I just want to point out that there is a promo code, Mobile Webinar 2, which you can use on Sauce for some free minutes as a thank you for participating in this webinar. Okay, we've got another few questions, which I'll go ahead and try and tackle. Lee asks whether there's any difference between Cordova, i.e. PhoneGap applications, and other hybrid or native apps with respect to Appium. And the answer is there's no difference at all. Appium has no special support for Cordova or PhoneGap apps beyond making it easy to access the web view. And so we do have some sample code and tutorials that make it particularly easy for PhoneGap/Cordova users to get started. And you can see some of those in the sample code on Appium's GitHub. But if you have an app that's not Cordova but is still a hybrid app, you can automate it just the same. Stella asks whether it's possible to use Appium with Sauce and with Jenkins. And yes, it's definitely possible. We have a lot of people who are doing that. And I would just write to the Appium discussion list, which is appium-discuss at googlegroups.com to ask who has been able to successfully implement this. I know that a few people have. Ravindar asked whether this recording will be available later, and I believe that it will. I think we've tried to record it as a video, and once we've got that processed and assuming that everything recorded okay, we're going to go ahead and release that through a blog post, probably on the Sauce Labs blog. So stay tuned to our blog and our Twitter accounts, and we'll try and get that out as soon as we can. So uh, thanks very much for your participation, and I hope that this information was valuable. We hope to see you next time we do an online event here at Sauce. Thank you.